Welcome back to Drowsy History. Get comfortable, whatever comfortable means for you right now. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Let the day begin to loosen its grip on you, slowly and without any rush. You have earned this. If this is your first time here, welcome. This is a place where history slows all the way down, where we take the long view, and where the past becomes something warm and quiet to drift off inside. Before we go anywhere tonight, I want to ask you something I genuinely look forward to reading. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is there right now. I love knowing how far these stories travel, that someone in Cairo is listening at midnight, that someone in Vancouver is falling asleep at 2 in the morning, that someone in Dublin is letting history wash over them in the blue quiet of an early evening. Tell me where you are, and if you hit subscribe before you drift off tonight, you will never miss a new episode, and that is the kindest thing you can do for this channel. Now, close your eyes if you like, or let them rest wherever is comfortable, and let us go somewhere extraordinary. Let us go to ancient Egypt, and let us go to the women who lived there, the ones who painted their faces and kept their secrets and understood things about bodies and magic and power that most of the world is only beginning to appreciate again. The ancient Egyptian woman has been misrepresented almost from the moment the first archaeologists began pulling her world out of the sand. She has been made into an icon of exotic mystery, or a submissive figure in a patriarchal civilization, or the subject of tourist fantasies that have very little to do with the actual human being who woke up each morning on the banks of the Nile and got on with the extraordinary complicated business of her life. The truth is considerably more interesting than any of those versions. Egyptian women, across almost 3,000 years of continuous civilization, occupied a legal and social position that their counterparts in ancient Greece and Rome would have found almost unbelievable. They could own property. They could sue in court. They could enter contracts, inherit land, and conduct business independently of any husband or male relative. They could divorce, and they could initiate divorce on their own authority. They could be physicians, priestesses, administrators, and rulers. They were, in many respects, the freest women in the ancient world, and the secrets they kept, the habits they maintained, the private rituals and daily practices that shaped their inner lives are worth knowing. Tonight, we are going to know them. Begin with the cosmetic chest, because that is where a great deal of an Egyptian woman's private life was kept. It sat in her bedroom or in her dressing room, carved from wood or alabaster or acacia or cedar depending on her means, fitted with small compartments and tiny ivory spoons and alabaster jars sealed with wax or linen stoppers. It held the materials of her daily transformation, and that transformation was not a performance for other people. It was a private ritual with medical, magical, and spiritual dimensions that went far deeper than the application of paint to a face. To understand what was in that chest and why is to begin to understand the inner life of an Egyptian woman in a way that no formal historical record quite captures. The cosmetic chest has been found in tombs across 3,000 years of Egyptian history, from humble earthenware containers in simple burials to the extraordinary gilded boxes found in royal tombs whose contents, Kohl tubes of alabaster, mirrors of polished bronze, combs of ivory and ebony, Tiny figures of the goddess Hathor worked into the handles of cosmetic spoons are among the most beautiful objects the ancient world produced. They were buried with their owners because they were understood as essential to continued existence. In the afterlife, as in this life, the Egyptian woman would need the tools of her daily ritual, and the thought of going into eternity without them was not to be entertained. Kohl was the most important substance in the cosmetic chest, and it was more than eyeliner. The dark pigment, made from ground galena, lead sulfide, malachite, stibnite, or other minerals depending on the era and the region, was applied to the eyes with a thin stick of wood, ivory, or metal in the characteristic almond-shaped lines that we now associate instantly with ancient Egypt. Every Egyptian woman wore it, from the poorest farmer's wife applying a cheap version made from soot and animal fat to the queen whose coal was ground by servants from imported minerals and kept in alabaster containers inlaid with gold. The application was precise, intentional, and loaded with meaning. The extended line at the outer corner of the eye echoed the shape of the Eye of Horus, the protective symbol that guarded against evil and illness. Wearing kohl was not only looking beautiful, it was wearing a talisman. It was invoking divine protection every morning as deliberately as a prayer. The medical dimensions of kohl were real and understood. Modern analysis has confirmed that the lead compounds in Egyptian kohl have genuine antibacterial properties, and that applying them around the eyes in the Egyptian climate, where flies, dust, and infection were constant threats, may have provided meaningful protection against conditions like trachoma, which could cause blindness. The Egyptians knew the connection empirically, if not biochemically. Medical papyri recommend kohl preparations for treating eye infections. The same substance that made you beautiful also kept your eyes healthy. In Egyptian thinking, these two functions were not separate. Beauty and health were both expressions of the divine order, of Ma'at, the cosmic principle of rightness and balance that governed everything from the movement of the Nile to the harmony of a well-run household. To be beautiful was to participate in the proper functioning of the world. Beyond kohl, the cosmetic chest held a variety of oils, fats, and perfumed ointments that were essential to Egyptian daily life in ways that modern people living in climate-controlled environments can sometimes fail to appreciate. Egypt is a dry country. The desert heat and the dry air are ferocious in ways that damage skin, crack lips, and cause the kind of chronic discomfort that makes ordinary life harder than it needs to be. The oils and fats that Egyptian women applied to their skin and hair every morning were not luxuries. They were necessities, the ancient equivalent of sunscreen and moisturizer combined, and they were taken seriously enough to appear in salary records, tomb offerings, and medical prescriptions alongside food and medicine. Castor oil, sesame oil, linseed oil, moringa oil, extracted from the ben nut tree and prized for its lightness and its ability to absorb fragrance. Animal fats of various kinds. All of these appear in the archaeological and textual record, used alone or in combination, sometimes infused with herbs or resins for scent, sometimes combined with beeswax to produce a stiffer ointment that could be applied to specific areas. The perfumed cones that appear in so many Egyptian banquet scenes, white cone-shaped objects balanced on the heads of elaborately dressed figures, have been a subject of scholarly debate for generations. For a long time, it was assumed that they were actual cones of fat or wax infused with fragrant resins, which would melt slowly over the course of an evening and release their scent. Recent analysis of tomb paintings and actual mummies has suggested a more complex picture. The cones may have been symbolic representations of the fragrant ointments that had already been applied to the hair and body, rather than actual objects worn on the head. Either way, the underlying reality is the same. Scent was a crucial element of Egyptian identity and ritual presentation, and the effort that went into producing, storing, and applying fragrant preparations was significant. Women who could afford it spent real time and real resources managing their scent, not out of vanity, but out of a culturally embedded understanding that fragrance had divine associations, that the gods themselves were described as sweet smelling, and that approaching the divine in a state of pleasing scent was a form of reverence. Hair in ancient Egypt was a political, sexual, and spiritual matter that occupied a great deal of Egyptian women's time and attention, and the hair practices of Egyptian women were considerably more complicated than a glance at the tomb paintings might suggest. Those smooth, heavy black wigs that appear in almost every formal representation of Egyptian women, falling in thick braids or columns to the shoulders or below, were not simply the fashion of the day. They were status markers, ritual objects, and in some contexts, items of profound symbolic significance, and the actual hair underneath them, or the absence of it, tells a story that the formal portraits conceal. Hair in Egyptian religious and mythological texts was associated with power, with vitality, and with the specific power of the feminine in ways that made managing it a matter of genuine symbolic importance. The goddess Hathor was strongly associated with hair. Her most distinctive attribute in certain forms was a cascading wig of enormous richness, and the Menet necklace that was her primary cult object had associations with her flowing hair. To care for one's hair with attention and skill was, in a sense, to participate in the feminine power that Hathor embodied, and to do it badly or carelessly was to fail at something that had implications beyond the merely aesthetic. Many Egyptians, women included, shaved their heads or kept their natural hair extremely short, especially in contexts involving ritual purity or medical necessity. The heat of the Egyptian summer, combined with the practical difficulty of keeping long natural hair free of lice and other parasites in a world without the chemical treatments we now take for granted, made short hair or shaved heads genuinely practical choices that also carried social meaning. Priests and priestesses of both sexes shaved their heads regularly as part of their ritual purification requirements. Children, regardless of sex, were often depicted and probably kept with shaved heads, except for a single lock on one side, the side lock of youth, that was ceremonially cut at puberty as a rite of passage. Women who had recently given birth might shave their heads as part of postpartum purification practices. None of this was considered unfeminine or unbeautiful, because the wig system meant that the visual presentation of luxuriant hair was available regardless of what was happening underneath. The wigs themselves were extraordinary objects. The best ones were made entirely from human hair, collected, we can only assume, from a combination of willing sellers and the offerings of the dead, carefully cleaned, sorted, braided, or curled according to the fashion of the moment, attached to a foundation of plant fiber, resin, or beeswax, and dressed with fat or oil to give them their characteristic glossy appearance. They were expensive. They were maintained with real care. They were stored in special wig boxes, rounded wooden containers specifically designed to protect the shape and condition of the wig inside, which appear in tomb inventories alongside jewelry and cosmetics as items of significant household value. A wealthy woman might own several wigs for different occasions, a longer, more elaborate style for formal occasions and festivals, a shorter, more practical style for daily wear, just as she might own different sets of jewelry for different purposes. But women who could not afford wigs, or who wore their natural hair, had their own elaborate traditions of care and adornment. Natural hair was braided and oiled, decorated with small ornaments, bead strings threaded onto the ends of braids, golden rings, faience beads, flowers on festival days. The lotus flower woven into a woman's braids was not just decorative. The lotus, which closes at night and reopens each morning, was a symbol of rebirth and renewal with deep religious significance. Wearing it in your hair was another form of the continuous low level religious practice that ran through every aspect of Egyptian life. The way that each small act of personal adornment connected the individual woman to the larger symbolic order of the universe. The Egyptian woman doing her hair in the morning was not merely making herself presentable, she was situating herself within the cosmic order, and the fact that she also looked beautiful doing it was entirely consistent with how the Egyptians thought about things. Hair treatments appear extensively in Egyptian medical papyri, which gives us a fascinating window into the anxieties and priorities of Egyptian women around their hair. Recipes for stimulating hair growth, for darkening gray hair, for treating hair loss. These appear repeatedly in texts that also discuss serious medical conditions, given equal weight, because in the Egyptian worldview, these were medical problems deserving medical solutions. One recipe for preventing hair from going gray involves the blood of a black calf cooked in oil and applied to the scalp. Another, which actually has some biochemical plausibility, involves rubbing the scalp with an onion preparation before exposure to the sun. There are recipes using hippopotamus fat, presumably for very wealthy patients, snake fat, for its perceived magical properties rather than any practical effect, and various herbal preparations that reflect a deep accumulated knowledge of plant properties. What is striking about all of these is their seriousness. These are not folk superstitions dismissed by educated society, but prescriptions recorded in the same texts used by trained medical practitioners. Hair was serious business. Perhaps the most intimate set of secrets kept in ancient Egyptian women's lives concerns the management of their own bodies, specifically the technologies of contraception, fertility, pregnancy, and childbirth that Egyptian women developed and used over thousands of years, and that represent one of the most sophisticated bodies of gynecological knowledge in the ancient world. The medical papyri that survive, the Ebers Papyrus, the Kohl Papyrus, and others, contain detailed prescriptions for contraceptives, fertility treatments, pregnancy tests, and treatments for complications of childbirth that demonstrate a level of empirical knowledge about female reproductive biology that is genuinely impressive, and that was, by definition, knowledge held primarily by women and passed between them. The Kahun Gynecological Papyrus dating to around 1800 BCE, is the oldest surviving medical text focused specifically on women's health, and its contents are revelatory. It contains prescriptions for contraceptives that include some ingredients modern pharmacology has confirmed have genuine efficacy. Among the most striking is a pessary made from crocodile dung mixed with a fermented dough, a combination that would have created a strongly acidic environment inhospitable to sperm, functioning in roughly the same way as a modern acidic spermicide. The crocodile dung specifically may have been chosen for its acidity, or it may have carried magical associations related to the power and protection of the crocodile god Sobek, or both. In Egyptian medical thinking, the practical and the magical were not competing explanations, but complementary ones, in a substance that worked for biochemical reasons and also had powerful symbolic associations, was simply a better medicine than one that only worked biochemically. Honey was another common ingredient in contraceptive prescriptions, and honey is known to have some spermicidal properties. Acacia gum, dissolved in honey and applied as a pessary, produces lactic acid that modern research has confirmed is indeed spermicidal. These were not random magical concoctions. They were the accumulated empirical discoveries of generations of women paying very close attention to what worked. Pregnancy tests in the Egyptian medical papyri are equally fascinating. One test, described in the Berlin Medical Papyrus, involves having the woman urinate on bags of wheat and barley seeds over several days and observing whether they germinate, and if so, which germinates first. If both germinate, she is pregnant. If neither does, she is not. If the wheat germinates first, she will have a boy. If the barley germinates first, a girl. In the 1960s, a German researcher actually tested this method and found that the urine of pregnant women does in fact promote germination of wheat and barley at significantly higher rates than the urine of non-pregnant women, apparently because of the hormones present in pregnant women's urine. The sex determination aspect does not work, but the pregnancy detection does. The Egyptians had stumbled onto, or rather had observed and systematized, a genuine biochemical phenomenon by the patient application of empirical observation over generations. This was not magic. This was science in its most fundamental form. Careful observation, repeated testing, accumulated knowledge. Childbirth itself was a dangerous and intensely ritualized event in ancient Egypt, surrounded by protective magic and attended by midwives whose knowledge was a combination of practical obstetric skill and ceremonial function. Women gave birth in a special birthing bower, a temporary structure of papyrus reeds erected in the garden or on the roof for the occasion, decorated with vine leaves and flowers, invoked as a sacred space separate from the ordinary house. The choice of papyrus was not random. Papyrus was the plant of Lower Egypt, associated with the goddess Wadjet, who protected women in childbirth, and its green, flexible stalks embodied the principle of regeneration and new life. Giving birth among papyrus reeds connected the laboring woman to the myth of Isis, who had hidden in the papyrus marshes of the Delta to give birth to Horus after the murder of Osiris, and who was therefore the divine prototype of the mother in danger who nevertheless prevails. The protective magic deployed around childbirth was extensive and overlapped constantly with practical care. Women in labor wore protective amulets, small figures of Bes, the dwarf lion god, who specifically protected women in childbirth and infants in the dangerous early weeks of life, and of Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess of pregnancy and birth, who is one of the more extraordinary figures in the Egyptian pantheon. A hippopotamus standing upright, with a crocodile on her back, lion paws, and a heavily pregnant belly, combining three of the most dangerous animals in Egypt into a single figure of protective power. These amulets were worn or held during labor. The midwife chanted prayers and protective spells. The birth brick, the low stool on which the woman squatted during delivery, was itself a ritual object, inscribed with protective texts and images. A decorated birth brick from the Middle Kingdom site of Abydos bears a painting of a mother nursing a newborn child with a protective serpent overhead, and has been interpreted as both the physical object on which a real woman crouched to deliver and a magical instrument charged with protective power. The practical and the sacred occupied exactly the same space in exactly the same moment without any sense of contradiction. The Egyptians were obsessed with perfume to a degree that is difficult to fully convey in an era when scent has been reduced to a commodity sold in department stores. For the Egyptians, fragrance was not a personal luxury, but a medium of communication between the human world and the divine one, and the production, use, and gifting of perfumed substances occupied a significant place in the economy, the religion, and the daily private life of Egyptian women. The word for perfume in ancient Egyptian is related to the word for divine fragrance, and the gods themselves are consistently described as emitting a sweet smell, the smell of incense, of lotus, of natron and cedar, that distinguished them from ordinary mortals, and that could be accessed, at least partially, by humans who wore the right sense. An Egyptian woman who anointed herself with fragrant oil before entering the temple was not indulging a vanity. She was making herself, at least symbolically, more fit to be in the divine presence. The great perfume-making centers of ancient Egypt were the temple laboratories, where priests and priestesses prepared the incense and anointing oils for ritual use according to recipes that were considered sacred knowledge and were inscribed on the walls of specific rooms within the temples, the so-called laboratory rooms, like those preserved at Edfu and Dendera, where the walls are covered with detailed lists of ingredients and preparation methods for specific ritual preparations. These inscriptions are among our best evidence for Egyptian perfumery, and they reveal a sophisticated understanding of the chemistry of fragrance. The Egyptians knew how to extract aromatic compounds from plant materials through pressing, soaking, and heating. They knew how to create stable preparations by combining aromatic substances with fixed oils or fats, and they knew how to layer fragrances to produce complex scented products that would evolve as they were worn. For ordinary women, the daily scent practice was simpler but no less intentional. The morning application of oil, moringa, sesame, or castor, depending on what she could afford, was often performed with a preparation that had been infused with something fragrant, dried flowers steeped in the oil, aromatic resins dissolved in it, or the prepared perfumed ointments sold in the market. Love poetry from the New Kingdom period is full of scent imagery that reveals how central fragrance was to Egyptian erotic and emotional life. Women in these poems are described in terms of their smell as smelling of lotus, of myrrh, of the clean air over the river, and the beloved's scent is referenced as one of the primary qualities that makes them irresistible. When a woman in an Egyptian love poem says that the smell of her lover's garments is like incense from the land of Punt, she is saying something that carries far more freight than a modern compliment about cologne. She is invoking the most precious and distant fragrance available to her world, the myrrh and frankincense of that legendary trading destination to the south, and placing her lover within that framework of divine sweetness. The flowers that Egyptian women wore and that appear constantly in their paintings and reliefs were also primarily about scent rather than just appearance. The blue lotus, Nymphea caerulea, was the most prized flower in Egyptian culture, and it was carried, worn in the hair, floated in wine, offered to the gods, and depicted in every medium from pottery to painting, with a consistency that tells us it was central to Egyptian ceremonial and sensory life. The blue lotus is mildly psychoactive, containing aporphine and nuciferine, alkaloids that produce mild euphoria and heightened sensory awareness, and the practice of floating lotus flowers in wine at banquets may have been not just aesthetic but pharmacological. Whether Egyptian women were conscious of this effect or simply found lotus wine pleasant and mood enhancing without fully analyzing why, the blue lotus was woven into their experience of beauty, celebration, and altered states in ways that we are only beginning to understand fully. It was not the only flower with this double dimension. Mandrake, which appears in New Kingdom banquet scenes being offered by women to other women with gestures that emphasize its desirability, is also psychoactive, and its presence in these scenes, which are explicitly associated with music, dancing, and physical pleasure, suggests an intentional use that has been somewhat sanitized by later scholarship. One of the most significant and least known dimensions of ancient Egyptian women's lives is the extent to which medicine was a female profession, at least in specific domains. The image of the ancient physician as exclusively male is not accurate for ancient Egypt. While the most prominent physicians named in the historical record are men, the practice of midwifery, of gynecological medicine, and of the kind of household healing that managed the day-to-day medical needs of a family was clearly within women's domain, and some women achieved formal recognition as medical practitioners in ways that give the lie to any simple story about Egyptian medicine being a male monopoly. The medical knowledge that Egyptian women held was not merely informal or transmitted through oral tradition without institutional recognition. It was encoded in written texts that were copied and studied. It was practiced in contexts that were formally structured and publicly acknowledged. And it was, in at least some cases, institutionally organized in ways that imply a professional community with its own hierarchy, its own standards, and its own traditions of training and transmission. The women who held and used this knowledge were not amateur caregivers filling the gaps left by the real medical profession. They were the real medical profession in their specific domains, and the domains they covered, reproductive health, childbirth, infant care, the day-to-day management of illness in the household, were the medical concerns that touched the greatest number of people's lives most directly and most urgently. Merit Ptah, identified in an inscription from around 2700 BCE as the chief physician, is one of the earliest named women in history and the earliest named woman in science. The inscription describing her has not survived in full, and there is some scholarly debate about the exact translation of her title, but the identification of a woman with the title of chief physician in the Old Kingdom period tells us something important. Whatever the specific scope of her practice, female medical authority was not inconceivable or exceptional in Egyptian culture. Later periods give us Pesachée, often described as a lady overseer of the female physicians, who appears in a tomb inscription from the 4th or 5th dynasty, and whose title, if accurately understood, implies not just an individual female physician, but the existence of an organized cadre of female medical practitioners, over whom a senior woman held authority. This is not a marginal or accidental fact. It represents an institutional acknowledgement of female medical expertise at a level that would not appear again in Western history until the 19th century. The wabet, the embalmer, was another role with both male and female practitioners, though here the evidence is more contested. Embalming was a ritual and technical process of enormous religious significance. It was the means by which the body was preserved for its journey through the afterlife, and the priests who performed it occupied a specific ritual role in the funeral rites. Some scholars have argued, based on the identification of female figures in certain contexts related to mummification, that women served as embalmers in specific capacities, perhaps specifically for the mummification of female bodies, paralleling the practice documented in Greek accounts. The two female figures who appear in certain religious scenes flanking the mummy, often identified as Isis and Nephthys, may reflect a ritual reality in which women played an active ceremonial role in the preparation of the dead, whether or not they were also the technical practitioners of the embalming process. The line between the ritual and the practical was in any case not a sharp one in Egyptian mortuary practice. The most documented female medical role is that of the midwife, the woman who attended births, managed complications, and carried the accumulated obstetric knowledge of the community. Egyptian midwives are not prominently named in the historical record, partly because their practice was embedded in female social networks rather than in the formal institutional structures that produced most of the surviving documents, but their existence is attested throughout Egyptian history and in multiple text types. The midwife's knowledge was extensive. She needed to know how to manage a normal birth, how to deal with a breech presentation, how to treat postpartum hemorrhage, how to support breastfeeding, how to recognize signs of infant illness in the early days of life. She also needed to know the protective prayers and ritual actions that framed childbirth as a sacred event, the spells for calling on Bes and Taweret, the protective invocations that accompanied the physical interventions. She was, in the truest sense, both a medical practitioner and a ritual specialist, and her knowledge was valuable enough to be passed carefully from generation to generation within female lineages and female communities. Herbal medicine was another domain in which Egyptian women's knowledge was both extensive and practically significant. The medical papyri are full of plant-based preparations for conditions that were primarily women's health concerns: menstrual irregularity, difficulties in conception, complications of pregnancy, and the depth of this knowledge implies a long tradition of female empirical inquiry into plant properties. Some of this knowledge has proven to have genuine pharmacological basis, The use of willow bark preparations for pain relief. Willow bark contains salicin, the precursor to aspirin. The use of garlic for infections. Garlic has documented antimicrobial properties. The use of cumin and coriander in digestive preparations. Both have confirmed efficacy for digestive complaints. Egyptian women were not practicing science in the modern sense, but they were doing what empirical inquiry does in any era: observing, testing, refining, accumulating, and transmitting knowledge across generations about what worked and what did not. Magic, or Heka, as the Egyptians called it, was not a fringe practice in ancient Egypt. It was one of the foundational principles of the universe, described in religious texts as existing before creation, as the power that the Creator God Himself used to bring the world into being. Every Egyptian, male and female, lived in a world saturated with magical forces that could be directed, propitiated, or defended against through the right actions, words, and objects. But the specific magical practices of Egyptian women, the private rituals, the personal protective magic, the spells used in the domestic and reproductive sphere, are a distinct body of practice with their own character and their own history, and they represent one of the most intimate windows we have into the interior lives of women who left relatively few other records of their inner experience. The distinction between magic and religion in the Egyptian world is not a distinction that the Egyptians themselves would have recognized, and forcing it onto the material distorts what we are looking at. The spells a woman recited over her sick child were prayers. The amulets she wore were sacred objects. The protective rituals she performed at the threshold of her home were acts of worship. The categories blurred so thoroughly in Egyptian practice that trying to separate them produces more confusion than clarity. What we can say is that the practices had a private, domestic, female dimension that ran alongside the public, institutional, priestly dimension, and that both were understood as drawing on the same underlying reality: the capacity of the informed and intentional human being to interact with the divine forces that governed the world. Amulets were the constant physical presence of magical protection in an Egyptian woman's life. She wore them from childhood, was buried with them, and accumulated new ones at significant life transitions. The ones she wore daily were typically small objects in faience, the Egyptian glazed composition material in its characteristic turquoise or blue-green color, or in semi-precious stones, carved bone, or occasionally gold and silver for the wealthy. The shapes encoded specific protective powers. The Wedjat eye, the eye of Horus, protected against the evil eye and illness. The Dajjed pillar, associated with Osiris and stability, provided protection against harm and the assurance of continuity. The Tayet, or Isis knot, was specifically associated with the protection of women and appears particularly frequently in contexts related to fertility, pregnancy, and childbirth. The knot form itself was not arbitrary. Untying a knot could loosen evil, and tying one could bind a protection, and the Isis knot's particular knotted form was a visual argument for the binding power of Isis's protective magic. Beyond the amulets worn on the body, Egyptian women maintained a more private magical life that left traces in the archaeological record in ways that are sometimes only retrospectively recognized as what they are. Votive deposits, small objects left at shrines or buried in domestic contexts, often included items specifically related to female concerns. Small clay figures of women and children, pottery figurines with emphasized female physical characteristics associated with fertility, small carvings of bound figures that may represent enemies being neutralized. These objects were deposited in specific places: at the threshold of the house, beneath the floor of the bedroom, in niches in the wall near the sleeping area, that suggest a deliberate magical placement rather than casual loss. The bedroom specifically was a site of heightened magical attention. It was where conception occurred, where dreams were received, and dreams were understood as direct communications from the divine world, and where the sleeper was most vulnerable to the malevolent spirits that Egyptian demonology populated the night with. The spells used by Egyptian women in private practice are preserved in several sources. The magical papyri, which contain a remarkable range of spells for everything from curing illness to gaining the love of a reluctant partner to preventing a neighbor's cow from giving better milk than yours. The charm objects found in domestic deposits, and the texts inscribed on magical wands, curved rods of hippopotamus ivory carved with protective deities that were used specifically in the context of childbirth and infant protection. The ivory wands are among the most physically beautiful objects produced by Egyptian craftspeople, their surfaces crowded with extraordinary figures of protective beings: knife bearing sphinxes, frogs, crocodiles, a turtle, strange hybrid creatures combining human and animal features, and always Bes and Taweret, prominently featured as the primary guardians of the household against the demons of the night. These wands were wielded by women. We see them in the hands of female figures in certain reliefs, drawn in a circle around the sleeping area or the birthplace to create a magical boundary that harmful forces could not cross. The woman who drew that circle was performing a ritual of the first order, a boundary making act that echoed the cosmological story of the sun god's journey through the dangerous darkness of the underworld, bounded and protected by the prayers of the night watchers. Dreams occupied a particularly important place in Egyptian women's magical and spiritual practice. The Egyptians understood dreams as a form of communication from the divine world, messages from gods, warnings from the dead, portents of future events, and the interpretation of dreams was a specialized skill that had both official, temple-based, and private, domestic forms. Women sought prophetic dreams deliberately through a practice called incubation, sleeping in a specific sacred place, or performing preparatory rituals before sleep in order to receive a divine message about a question of pressing concern. Fertility was one of the most common subjects for which dream incubation was sought. A woman who was struggling to conceive might sleep at the shrine of a fertility deity, having performed the appropriate prayers and offerings in the hope of receiving divine guidance in a dream about what she needed to do. The line between this practice and prayer in any other tradition is not a very thick one, but what is striking is how active and intentional the Egyptian version was. Not a passive petition, but a deliberate technology for accessing divine knowledge, available to any woman who knew the procedure and was willing to perform it. The love poetry of ancient Egypt is one of the most remarkable bodies of literature to survive from any pre-modern civilization, and it is remarkable partly for what it reveals about the inner emotional lives of the women who wrote it or who are represented in it. The surviving love poems, most of them from the New Kingdom period, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, preserved in papyri and on pottery ostraca, describe desire, longing, the physical experience of being in love, and the specific sensory pleasures of the beloved's presence with a directness and an earthiness that catches modern readers off guard. This is not the elevated courtly language of medieval love poetry. This is a young woman lying on her bed at night thinking about a man's voice and the way it made her heart race, and not being ashamed of any of it. It is a young woman describing her heart as a small bird flapping against the inside of her chest when she sees her beloved across the garden. It is a young woman devising increasingly elaborate stratagems to arrange accidental meetings, fretting about rivals, exulting in small victories, suffering through periods of separation with an almost physical ache. These are recognizable human experiences, and the fact that they were considered worthy of literary treatment, that someone thought to write them down and preserve them, and that other people thought to copy them and carry them with them, tells us something important about how Egyptian culture valued the emotional and erotic experiences of women, not as shameful secrets to be managed or suppressed, but as real and significant dimensions of human life that deserved the attention of art. The most important collection is the group of poems known as the Chester Beatty Papyrus One, preserved in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, which contains a sequence of poems alternating between a male and female voice in a kind of erotic dialogue. The female speaker in these poems is specific, physical, and unembarrassed. She describes her beloved's appearance in detailed terms that do not flinch at the physical. She describes her own desire with equal frankness. She is scheming and strategic as well as feeling. She has complicated plans to engineer encounters, to make herself visible and irresistible, to manage the social obstacles that keep them apart. She is not a passive object of desire waiting to be claimed. She is a subject with her own desire, her own strategy, and her own voice, and the poetry that preserves that voice is written in a tradition that clearly found these qualities admirable or at least entirely normal. The physical world of Egyptian love poetry is saturated with the sensory details that structured Egyptian women's daily experience. Flowers, always the lotus, hair and its smell, the taste of wine, the sound of the beloved's voice, the sight of him walking in the garden, the cool air of the evening by the river. These are the materials of which the poems are made, and they are the same materials that appear in the cosmetic rituals, the perfume traditions, and the daily domestic practices we have been exploring. The poems are not separate from everyday life. They emerge directly from it. The woman in the poem who twists a lock of her hair and thinks of her beloved is the same woman who spent the morning dressing that hair with oils and ornaments and arranging the lotus she had tucked into her braids. The poems are the interior voice of the woman we see in the paintings, and together they produce something that neither could produce alone: a fully dimensional human being with a body, a face, a set of daily practices, and a rich and specific inner life. Love magic was a real and documented practice in ancient Egypt, and the surviving magical spells for attracting love or binding a beloved are among the most personal and revealing documents of Egyptian private life. Some of these spells are tender and wistful. Some are frankly coercive, binding spells that attempted to force the emotions of an unwilling person, which occupy an ethically complicated space that the Egyptians themselves apparently recognized, since such spells often appear in contexts suggesting they were used furtively or with some awareness of their transgressive nature. But the majority of the surviving love spells are simply the magical dimension of the same desire expressed in the poetry. A young woman wanting very much to be noticed, to be remembered, to be chosen, and using every tool available to her, including the practical and the magical, to make it happen. The ingredients specified in these spells reveal the same empirical understanding of the sensory world that characterizes Egyptian medicine: fragrant substances, flower petals, preparations that would affect the person who smelled or touched them in ways the spellcaster understood intuitively, if not analytically. Love magic was not separate from the perfumery, the cosmetics, and the physical self presentation of Egyptian women. It was part of the same continuous project of deliberate self construction. Marriage in ancient Egypt was a practical arrangement made between families or between adults without requiring any formal religious or state ceremony. There was no Egyptian wedding in the sense of a legal procedure or a priestly ritual. A couple was considered married when they set up a household together, and the woman who moved into a man's house or who established a shared household with him in some other arrangement acquired the status of wife, along with specific legal protections that were significant and documented. But the absence of a formal ceremony did not mean that the transition was unmarked. Contemporary sources suggest that the establishment of a new household was celebrated with feasting and music, and that friends and family participated in a social acknowledgement of the new union, even if no legal authority needed to ratify it. The woman entering marriage took with her whatever property was hers: jewelry, household goods, any land or income she controlled, and maintained her legal identity as a separate person capable of making contracts and owning property independently of her husband. The emotional content of Egyptian marriage is harder to recover from the formal legal record, but the love poetry and the funerary inscriptions that describe grief at a spouse's death paint a picture of marriages that were often at their best genuine partnerships built on affection and shared life. The popular image of ancient Egyptian women's lives tends to focus on the domestic and the decorative: the beautiful women at the banquet, the devoted mothers in the tomb paintings, the queens in their gold and lapis lazuli. But Egyptian women worked in an extraordinary range of occupations and roles across the full spectrum of Egyptian society, and the working lives they led were as varied and as economically significant as those of men. The formal records, the lists of workers at royal construction projects, the accounts of temple estates, the contracts and receipts preserved in the dry Egyptian climate reveal women buying and selling property, managing large estates, running businesses, and participating actively in the formal economy in ways that have no equivalent in any other ancient Mediterranean civilization. What makes this particularly striking is that it was not exceptional. A woman engaging in economic activity in ancient Egypt was not performing a feat of exceptional courage or navigating hostile social attitudes. She was exercising rights that were simply hers by law, that her neighbors and her community recognized without friction, and that the legal system backed up with a court process she could initiate and participate in on her own authority. The mundanity of female economic activity in the Egyptian record is, in its way, the most radical thing about it. At the upper end of the social scale, women in wealthy families might manage substantial estates during the absence or after the death of their husbands with a competence that is attested in the surviving administrative documents. Letters written by women to agents managing their estates show a confident familiarity with the details of agricultural production, the management of workers, and the maintenance of property that is only consistent with ongoing involvement rather than crisis management by someone unfamiliar with the work. The woman who writes to her agent specifying exactly what she expects from the grain harvest and exactly how she wants her accounts organized is not a figurehead or a temporary substitute. She is the boss, and she expects to be treated as such. Women at every social level participated in the textile industry, which was one of the most important sectors of the ancient Egyptian economy. Weaving was done primarily by women in both household and institutional settings. The great weaving workshops attached to temples and royal estates employed large numbers of women who produced the linen that was Egypt's most important domestic textile and one of its most significant trade goods. Fine Egyptian linen was prized throughout the ancient Mediterranean and Near East for its quality and fineness. The finest grades were literally as thin as air, translucent and smooth in ways that modern industrial production has difficulty matching, and the women who produced it were skilled workers whose expertise was economically valuable. The weaving workshop was a female institution in ancient Egypt, and the social life that developed within it, the hierarchies of skill, the training of younger workers by older ones, the communal working day, was a female community with its own culture and its own dynamics. Female musicians, singers, and dancers occupied a specific and socially important role in Egyptian ceremonial life that goes beyond what those occupations suggest in a modern context. Temple musicians, the Shemayat, the sistrum players who accompanied religious rituals in the great temple complexes, were a recognized institutional role for women of good family with religious significance and genuine social status. The sistrum, the metal rattle, whose distinctive sound was associated with the goddess Hathor and with the generative energy she represented, was played by women in contexts that mixed the musical with the ritual. The sound of the sistrum was believed to please the gods, to stimulate their benevolence, and to participate in the maintenance of cosmic order. A woman who shook the sistrum in the inner sanctum of a temple was performing an act of genuine religious power, and the training required to do it properly was substantial. The women who served as musicians in the household ensembles of the wealthy elite occupied a related but distinct role. They were professional entertainers in the modern sense, hired for their skill, but they operated within a social framework that understood music and dance as activities with cosmic as well as aesthetic dimensions. Trading women appear throughout Egyptian records in roles that range from small-scale market activity, the woman selling bread or oil from her house or her stall in the marketplace, to larger-scale commercial operations involving the purchase of significant property. The legal records include transactions in which women buy slaves, purchase houses, and acquire land in their own names, sometimes in amounts that suggest they were not impoverished or acting from desperation, but making deliberate economic investments. One of the most interesting categories of women in the economic record is the female innkeeper, the woman who ran a house of beer and bread for travelers and locals, whose role is attested in both literary and documentary sources. She is sometimes presented as a somewhat disreputable figure in the literary sources, associated with the casual mixing of classes and the loosening of social restraints that in culture enables in every era. But the practical economic role she played was significant and recognized, and the women who ran these establishments were independent businesswomen in every meaningful sense. The religious life of ancient Egypt was one in which women participated not merely as worshippers, but as officials, ritualists, and in some cases, as the primary holders of divine power within a particular cult. The history of women's religious roles in Egypt is complex and varies considerably across the 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization. But at several points and in several cults, women occupied positions of religious authority that represented genuine power, economic, symbolic, and institutional, in the Egyptian world. Understanding the nature and the extent of that authority requires setting aside some assumptions that modern people bring to the topic. The assumption that religious authority in ancient societies was almost always male, the assumption that female religious roles were primarily supportive or ornamental, and the assumption that the evidence for female religious participation is sparse enough to make reconstruction uncertain. None of these assumptions is accurate for ancient Egypt. The evidence is rich, the roles were substantial, and the women who held them were conscious of their significance and recorded it with the same pride that male officials recorded their secular achievements. A woman who served as a priestess of Hathor for 30 years and had it inscribed in her tomb was making a statement about the shape and meaning of her life, and we should read it as such. In the Old and Middle Kingdoms, the role of musical priestess, the Hamet Netcher, literally God's wife, was a common way for women of the elite class to participate formally in temple cult. These women served as the female counterpart to the male priests in specific rituals, most often those involving Hathor, the goddess of love, beauty, music, and feminine power, who was one of the most widely worshipped deities in the Egyptian pantheon. The musical and ritual activities of these women within the temple were understood as sustaining the goddess's presence and goodwill, and the social status associated with the title was real. Being a Hemet was a mark of elite family background and religious respectability, something recorded proudly in inscriptions alongside marital status and other indicators of social position. The role of God's wife became considerably more politically charged in the New Kingdom and later periods, when the title God's wife of Amun became one of the most powerful positions in Egypt, vested in a woman who held the title as a divine appointment that required her to remain celibate. The union with the god Amun being, in this theology, her primary relationship, and who controlled the economic resources of the Amun cult, which in the New Kingdom period meant control of a significant fraction of the productive agricultural land in Egypt. The god's wife of Amun was not a symbolic figurehead. She was an economic and political power in her own right, who could appoint her own administration, conduct her own transactions, and conduct religious rituals whose importance was as great as those conducted by the male high priest. Several of these gods' wives were daughters of pharaohs, placed in the role as a strategic move by their fathers to extend royal control over the wealth of the Amun priesthood. In the Third Intermediate Period and the Late Period, the position essentially functioned as an alternative rulership, a female sovereign of the temple economy, whose authority complemented and sometimes rivaled that of the pharaoh. Women served as priests and priestesses in the cults of specific goddesses, Hathor, Neith, Wadjet, Mut, in ways that gave them access to the inner sanctuaries of temples that most Egyptians, male or female, never entered. The interior of an Egyptian temple was a sacred space maintained in conditions of extreme ritual purity, accessible only to those who had undergone the required purification and been invested with the required ritual authority. A woman who served as a priestess of Hathor had undergone that purification, held that authority, and could enter the presence of the goddess in a way that very few people could. Whatever that experience was, the silence of the inner sanctuary, the smell of the incense, the dimness and the specific quality of light filtered through high windows, it was not available to most people and was a form of privilege and experience that the women who had it clearly valued. The inscriptions recording priestly service are proud documents, boasting of decades of faithful service and the closeness to the divine that it involved. Female oracles are another fascinating dimension of women's religious authority in Egypt. The oracle tradition, in which the statue of a god, carried in procession by priests, would indicate answers to questions by moving in a particular direction or stopping before a specific petitioner, was one of the most important mechanisms of divine communication in Egyptian popular religion, and women both asked questions of oracles and served as the instruments of oracular communication in certain traditions. The presence of the deceased in the world of the living was also accessed through women in specific ways. The practice of appealing to dead relatives for help with practical problems, asking a deceased mother to intercede with the gods for a sick child, asking a dead husband to stop causing bad dreams, is attested in letters written on pottery or papyrus and placed in tombs. And many of these letters are written by women, reflecting a practice of female mediation with the dead that ran alongside and complemented the formal institutional religion of the temples. The feeding of ancient Egypt was largely women's work, from the grinding of grain at the household level to the management of the great brewing and baking operations that produced the two staples, bread and beer, that formed the foundation of the Egyptian diet at every social level. The domestic food production of Egyptian women was not simply cooking in the modern sense. It was the management of a complex daily process that involved grinding, soaking, fermenting, baking, and preserving using equipment and techniques that required real skill and substantial physical labor in the service of households whose hunger was a constant and pressing concern. And it was not only a household matter. The great institutional food operations of ancient Egypt, the bakeries and breweries that fed the thousands of workers who built the pyramids and the tombs, the kitchen establishments of the temples that produced the daily offerings for the gods, and the subsequent redistribution of those offerings to the temple staff, the palace provisioning systems that fed the royal household and its enormous establishment. These were all built on the same knowledge base and the same fundamental techniques that every Egyptian woman managed in her own home. The scale was different. The knowledge was the same. Beer, Egyptian beer specifically, is not what most modern people imagine when they hear the word. It was thick, nutritious, and only moderately alcoholic, produced by a process that combined bread making and fermentation in ways that are still not entirely understood by modern food historians. The basic method involved making a partially baked loaf of bread, sometimes from emmer wheat, sometimes from barley, crumbling it into a vat of water, allowing it to ferment with the wild yeasts present in the flour and the environment, and then straining out the solids to produce the liquid product. The result was a beverage with a consistency closer to a thin porridge than to modern beer, sweet and slightly sour from the fermentation, nutritious enough that it could constitute a significant part of the caloric intake of workers. Women brewed beer at the household level, and women ran the professional brewing operations that supplied the large institutions, the pyramid building camps, the temple estates, the royal palace that needed to provision large numbers of workers. The female brewer is one of the most common figures in Egyptian model figures from tombs, depicted in the act of working the mash or straining the liquid, and the frequency of her appearance in this funerary context tells us something about how central her function was to the economic life of the household and the community. The grinding of grain was perhaps the most physically demanding daily labor performed by ordinary Egyptian women, and the evidence for its toll on their bodies is written into their skeletons. Archaeological analysis of female remains from ancient Egyptian sites shows a characteristic pattern of wear on the knee and toe joints consistent with long periods spent kneeling in the position required by the saddle quern, the stone grinding tool used for most of Egyptian history, and degenerative changes in the vertebrae of the lower back consistent with the repeated forward and back motion of the grinding stroke. This is not accidental or occasional injury. This is the evidence of years of daily labor written permanently into bone. The women depicted in the model granaries and bakeries of Middle Kingdom tombs bent over their grinding stones with the calm efficiency of the professional were performing a task that would mark their bodies for life, and the cheerful appearance of the tomb figures should not make us forget that. The feasts of the Egyptian elite were elaborate productions that required substantial planning and skilled management, and the women who organized them, the great ladies of wealthy households, were doing something that required both social intelligence and genuine organizational capacity. The menu at an elite banquet might include multiple meat dishes. Oxen were the prestige meat, supplemented by ducks and geese and smaller birds, a variety of breads and cakes, fish preparations, vegetables, fruits both fresh and preserved, wine and beer, and the various aromatic preparations that accompanied eating. The serving at these banquets was done by servants, many of them women, whose function was not merely logistical, but also aesthetic and ritualistic. The women who appear in banquet paintings, serving guests and bringing lotus flowers and musical instruments, were participating in a ceremonial production that was partly about pleasure and partly about demonstrating the host's capacity to channel abundance and to participate in the Egyptian ideal of the well-ordered, generous household. Death in ancient Egypt was one of the most carefully managed and religiously elaborate events in the culture, and women occupied specific and essential roles in the rituals surrounding it. The mourning women who appear in funerary procession reliefs, figures with arms raised above their heads or thrown forward, hair loose and disordered, wailing in visible grief, were not simply exhibiting natural emotion. They were performing a specific ritual function that was understood as essential to the successful passage of the dead into the afterlife. Professional mourning women, paid to perform the ritual lamentations at funerals, were a recognized institution in ancient Egypt, and their specific gestures, postures, and vocalizations were a codified ritual language with deep religious meaning. The disordered hair was not accidental. Loose, unplaited hair was the visual sign of a state outside the normal order of things, the marker of crisis and transition that the death of a person represented. A woman who appeared in public with her hair down in ordinary circumstances was signaling distress. At a funeral, the same gesture became a ritual act that acknowledged the disruption of cosmic order that death represented and participated in the process of restoring it. The model for female mourning was the goddess Isis herself, who mourned the murdered Osiris with a grief so powerful that it literally reconstituted his dismembered body and restored him to life, at least long enough to conceive Horus. The story of Isis, searching for the scattered pieces of Osiris, traveling through the marshes, her hair loose and disordered, her wailing heard by all the creatures of the world, was the divine template for human mourning, and every Egyptian woman who raised her arms and wailed at a funeral was enacting that divine story. She was not just expressing grief, she was channeling the regenerative power of Isis's love, the power that had defeated death once, and that was being invoked to do so again for the specific dead person now making the transition. The professional mourner's wail was therefore a form of prayer, a ritual invocation with real cosmological stakes, and the women who performed it were religious specialists in the same sense that the priests who spoke the formal liturgy were religious specialists. The two specific ritual roles of Isis and Nephthys, the divine sisters who mourned at the head and feet of Osiris, and whose presence was essential for the proper preparation of the mummy and the successful journey through the underworld, were reflected in actual human practice. In certain periods, two women served in ritual roles at funerals that explicitly identified them with Isis and Nephthys, wearing markers of divine identity and performing specific ritual actions that mirrored the mythological narrative. The fact that these roles were available to human women, that ordinary women could embody the divine sisters in this context, speaks to the Egyptian understanding that the boundary between the human and the divine was permeable in ritual contexts, and that women specifically had access to this kind of divine embodiment in the mortuary sphere. The funerary provisions that wealthy Egyptian women accumulated during their lifetimes represent another window into the private values and concerns of their inner lives. A woman who commissioned a set of shabtes, the small, mummy-form figures that were buried with the dead to serve as their substitutes for the agricultural labor required of souls in the afterlife, and inscribed them with her own name, was making a statement about her concern for her own afterlife and her investment in the technologies of immortality that Egyptian religious life offered. The jewelry prepared specifically for burial, sometimes more elaborate than anything worn in life, sometimes including pieces specifically inscribed with funerary texts, was another investment in posthumous well being. Egyptian women did not simply endure their own mortality, they managed it, planned for it, prepared for it with the same practical attention they brought to every other domain of their lives. One of the most fascinating and long overlooked dimensions of ancient Egyptian women's bodily practice is the tradition of tattooing, which we now know was far more widespread and more meaningful than the fragmentary early evidence suggested. For much of Egyptology's history, the tattooed figures that appeared in certain tomb paintings were interpreted as foreign women, dancing girls from Nubia, entertainers with exotic markings, because the assumption that respectable Egyptian women would not be tattooed was so deeply embedded that it shaped how the evidence was read. The discovery of tattooed mummies, most recently and dramatically, the extraordinarily well preserved mummies from Deir el Medina, whose tattoos were revealed by infrared imaging, has forced a complete revision of this assumption. Egyptian women tattooed their bodies, and the tattoos they bore were not ornamental or exotic. They were deeply meaningful markings that carried protective, medicinal, and status related significance. The oldest known Egyptian tattoos, found on female mummies from the pre dynastic and early dynastic periods, consist of geometric patterns, parallel lines, dots, diamond shapes, concentrated on the abdomen, thighs, and upper arms. The placement on the abdomen and thighs is particularly significant because it concentrates the marking in the areas most associated with fertility, pregnancy, and childbirth. Several scholars have proposed that these tattoos functioned as permanent fertility amulets, that the geometric patterns were a form of protective marking that would be activated during pregnancy and labor, serving a similar protective function to the more portable amulets that could be worn or removed. The permanence of the tattoo made it a form of protection that could never be lost or forgotten. A woman who had been tattooed with fertility markings carried that protection in her body for her entire life, and the decoration of the same areas of the body that would expand during pregnancy with markings specifically placed there for protective purposes has a logic that would have been entirely coherent within the Egyptian understanding of how bodies, protection, and magic worked. The more recent discovery of tattooed mummies from Deir el Medina, the village of craftsmen and artisans who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings during the New Kingdom period, has added an entirely new dimension to the picture. These mummies bear not geometric patterns, but figurative tattoos, images of Bes, the protective dwarf god, seated female figures identified with Hathor, eyes of Horus, and other explicitly religious symbols. The placement of the Bes figure on the thighs of female mummies is striking, because Bes was specifically the protector of women in childbirth, and tattooing his image permanently onto the body in this location transforms the body itself into a living amulet, a walking prayer for protection during the most dangerous physical experience of a woman's life. These were not decorative tattoos, they were permanent petitions to a specific protective deity, inscribed on the body with a seriousness that reflects the genuine terror of childbirth in a world without modern medical intervention and the genuine trust in the protective power of Bes that the archaeological record shows was central to Egyptian women's religious practice. The process of tattooing in ancient Egypt was carried out using sharp points, bronze needles or bone tools, and a pigment of carbon black or another dark substance rubbed into the puncture wounds. The procedure was painful and carried the risk of infection, and the decision to undergo it was therefore not a casual one. Women who chose to be tattooed were making a significant commitment, and the fact that they did so in large enough numbers for the practice to be well documented in the mummy record tells us something important about how meaningful these markings were within the cultural framework of Egyptian women's lives. A tattoo that took pain to acquire and that would be visible for the rest of one's life, and that would, in Egyptian belief, carry its meaning and its protective power into the afterlife, was not a fashion statement. It was a biographical document, a permanent record of devotion to a specific deity and of the specific protections one needed and sought in this life. No account of ancient Egyptian women's secret habits and inner lives would be complete without acknowledging the most extreme expression of Egyptian women's potential for power. The female pharaohs who ruled Egypt in their own names, and the women who ruled as regents for young sons or brothers and left unmistakable marks on the historical record. These women were not anomalies or accidents. They were the logical extreme of a social and legal system that uniquely in the ancient world allowed women to own, inherit, and exercise authority in their own right, and the fact that this system occasionally produced a woman who exercised that ultimate authority is not surprising. What is surprising is how effectively they exercised it, and how deliberately later history tried to erase them. The erasure itself is informative. You do not spend significant political and artistic resources erasing a predecessor unless that predecessor's existence is a genuine problem for the story you are trying to tell about power, legitimacy, and who gets to hold them. The fact that female pharaohs were erased tells us that they existed in sufficient numbers and with sufficient visibility to require active suppression, and that the ideology of male kingship that the erasure served was not stable enough to simply absorb the anomalies without attempting to delete them. History, even ancient history, is written by winners, and what the winners chose to erase is as informative as what they chose to preserve. Hatshepsut, who ruled as pharaoh for roughly 20 years in the 18th dynasty, is the best known of Egypt's female rulers, and her story is one of the most extraordinary in Egyptian history. She began as the wife of Thutmose II and then regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, a role that was conventional enough given the precedents for female regency in Egyptian history. What was unconventional was what she did next. Rather than relinquishing power as Thutmose III grew older, she declared herself pharaoh, assumed the full titles and regalia of the office, and ruled as king of Egypt, with a king's throne name, a king's crook and flail, and, in official representations, a king's false beard and male body, while other images preserved her female identity without apparent contradiction or confusion. She was not pretending to be male. She was claiming the office of pharaoh, which was a male gender category in Egyptian theology, without ceasing to be female, and the Egyptian representational system accommodated this by producing images of both kinds without treating the discrepancy as a problem. Hatshepsut's reign was by any measure a successful one. She organized and led a major trading expedition to the land of Punt, that legendary source of myrrh, frankincense, ebony, and exotic animals that was the most prestigious trading destination in the Egyptian world, and memorialized it in extraordinary relief sculptures on the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el Bahri, one of the most beautiful architectural achievements of the New Kingdom. She built extensively. She maintained Egypt's borders. She oversaw a period of relative peace and prosperity. The erasure of her image from monuments and inscriptions that occurred under Thutmose III, some 20 years after her death, was once interpreted as evidence of his rage at her usurpation, a posthumous revenge. More recent scholarship has suggested that the erasure was more calculated. It happened late in his reign, possibly as a succession planning measure to ensure that the line of male descent was clear and it was selective rather than total. Whatever its motivation, it was thorough enough that her identity was lost for most of the modern era of Egyptology until scholars began assembling the erased images and the suspicious absence of her name in sequences of pharaohs into a coherent picture of a reign that could no longer be denied. Other female rulers, Sobek Neferu, who ruled at the end of the Middle Kingdom, Tusret, who ruled at the end of the 19th dynasty, the earlier and more shadowy figure of Nitocris, complete a picture of female sovereignty that was unusual but not impossible in Egyptian political culture. Each of them assumed the kingship in circumstances of political crisis or succession uncertainty, and each of them held the throne for periods ranging from months to years with varying degrees of success. What is notable about all of them is the sophistication with which they navigated the ideological constraints of a kingship ideology that was, at its theological core, male. The pharaoh was the embodiment of Horus, son of Osiris, and the masculine divine imagery was deeply embedded in the office, while deploying their authority effectively in the practical business of governing Egypt. They found ways to be female rulers in a system that did not have a formal template for female rulers, and they did it by being simultaneously pragmatic and bold. They could not have done it if the broader social structure had not already established the principle that women could exercise authority, own property, and act independently. The female pharaoh was the apex of a pyramid whose base was the ordinary Egyptian woman who could sue in court, run her own business, and conduct her own religious practice without reference to any male authority. Perhaps the most intimate documents of ancient Egyptian women's inner lives are the letters they wrote to each other, to their husbands and sons, and to the gods and the dead. Egyptian letters survive in remarkable numbers given the conditions of their production and survival, preserved by the same dry desert climate that has given us the mummies and the papyri and the tomb paintings, and the letters written by and to women are among the most personally revealing documents in the entire corpus of ancient Egyptian writing. They are not formal declarations or religious texts. They are people talking to each other across distances, trying to manage the ordinary complexity of lives that were full of the same concerns that fill modern lives: money, health, family obligations, professional anxieties, and the desire to be cared for and understood by the people one loves. The letters of Egyptian women are frequently practical and businesslike in their primary content, reflecting the economic reality of women who managed estates, oversaw production, and conducted transactions. A woman writing to her agent about the grain harvest or to her son about a legal dispute over property is using the letter form for what it was primarily meant for, the management of affairs across a distance. But within the practical framework, the personal always surfaces. A woman writing about the grain harvest also mentions that she is worried about her daughter's health. A woman writing to a distant son about a property dispute slips in a line about how much she misses him. The letters are not literary productions crafted for posterity. They are tools of communication, and the emotions that appears in them appear because they were real and pressing, and the letter was the available medium for expressing them. The letters written to the dead, a category of Egyptian document that has no real parallel in any other ancient culture, are particularly moving when they come from women, and many of them do. The practice of writing a letter to a deceased relative, typically on a pottery vessel or bowl that would be left in the tomb, was used to communicate with the dead about practical problems that the living believed the dead could influence. A wife whose husband had died and who was then experiencing misfortune might write him a letter accusing him of failing to protect her from beyond the grave, or asking him to intercede with the divine powers on her behalf. A woman whose child was ill might write to her deceased mother, asking her to speak to the gods for the child's recovery. The tone of these letters ranges from formal petition to something much more personal. Real grief, real anger, real intimacy breaking through the formulaic opening phrases. One letter, written by a man to his deceased wife, but preserved in a context that suggests it was composed with a woman's help or in a traditions to female practice, addresses the wife directly and tenderly, telling her that he has never done anything to deserve the trouble he is now experiencing, implying that he believes she is somehow responsible for his current suffering from beyond the grave, a remarkably frank accusation that carries real emotional charge, regardless of its theological framework. The letters that pass between women in Egyptian documents reveal networks of female support, information exchange, and emotional connection that existed alongside but somewhat separately from the male dominated institutional world of the state and the temple. Women wrote to each other about pregnancies and illnesses, about the behavior of servants and the quality of goods available in the market, about family news and neighborhood gossip. They sent each other small gifts with the letters: a piece of cloth, a jar of oil, a cake. They asked each other for favors that used their specific social connections. Could her correspondent put in a word with a particular official? Could she send word about what had happened in a legal case they were both watching? Could she find out whether a particular person had arrived safely? These letters document a female social world that was rich and active and mutually supportive, and they complicate any simple picture of ancient Egyptian women as isolated domestic figures without access to the social and informational networks that gave ancient Egyptian life much of its texture. We have ranged widely tonight through the formal institutions and the documented practices of ancient Egyptian women's lives. Let us end somewhere quieter and more intimate, in the private hours of an ordinary afternoon, in the middle of an ordinary day, in the life of a woman who was neither a pharaoh nor a priestess nor a physician, but simply a person managing the ordinary complexity of existence in one of the most extraordinary civilizations the world has produced. This imagined afternoon is constructed from the accumulated evidence of everything we have examined tonight: the physical spaces of Egyptian houses, the objects found in them, the documents produced by their inhabitants, and the material culture of daily life that archaeology has recovered from thousands of years of silence. The house she lives in is a two-story mud brick structure in a town on the west bank of the Nile, its whitewashed exterior bright in the afternoon sun, its interior dim and cool in the way that thick mud brick walls create even in the heat of an Egyptian summer. She has been up since early morning, grinding grain, supervising the preparation of the household's bread and beer, nursing the baby, managing the household slaves if she has them or the household's needs directly if she does not. The grinding is the hardest part of the morning, the most physically demanding, and it is done. The flour is made, the dough is set to rise, the beer is fermenting in its vat, the baby is fed and sleeping. The older children are at school or at some supervised occupation. Her husband is at the workshop or in the fields or at whatever work defines his days. The afternoon is, for this hour, hers. She goes to her dressing table, a low wooden surface with a mirror of polished bronze propped against the wall, a cosmetic chest beside it, and she sits. The ritual of the afternoon cosmetics is not what she performed in the morning, which was functional and quick, a matter of protection and presentation before the day began. This is more leisurely, more personal, a moment of attending to herself without the pressure of the day's obligations already pressing. She opens the cosmetic chest and takes out the Kohl tube, a small cylinder of alabaster or faience, and the thin ivory stick. She leans toward the bronze mirror, which returns her image in warm, slightly soft-edged tones, and she redraws the lines that the morning's heat and activity have smudged. The gesture is practiced, automatic, deeply familiar. She has been doing it since she was a girl, watching her mother, imitating until she had the skill. After the coal, the oil, she pours a small amount of moringa oil from its container into her palm and works it slowly into the dry skin of her face, her neck, her arms. The oil is lightly scented. She had a preparation made at the market a few weeks ago, infused with dried lotus petals, and the smell of it is mild and sweet and entirely pleasant in the afternoon quiet. She works it in slowly without hurrying, feeling the slight relief as the dry skin absorbs it. This is not vanity. This is maintenance, the management of a body in a dry country, in a hot season, and the fact that it also feels good and also makes her smell pleasant is simply the Egyptian principle in action. The practical and the pleasurable and the sacred are not different categories. They are one thing, it's experienced simultaneously. She takes the lotus flower she cut from the garden this morning, already slightly wilted in the heat, but still fragrant, and holds it for a moment, breathing it in. There is a small shrine in the corner of the room, a wooden cabinet with its doors standing open, containing a figure of Taweret in faience, a small clay figure of Bess, a little wooden figure she cannot quite identify that was her mother's, and a cup in which she has put a few drops of oil and a dried flower as an offering. She says the prayer she says every afternoon, quietly, without particular ceremony. She is not in a temple. She does not need to be. The gods are where she is. She has understood this her whole life. She picks up the letter she has been composing for her sister, who lives 3 days' travel to the south and whom she has not seen since the festival of Hathor in the autumn. The letter has been started and put down several times. It begins with the standard formulas. She calls on Amun and Ptah and Re to keep her sister well and healthy. She invokes the gods of her sister's city for her protection, and then it becomes something else, something more personal. She has been worrying about her sister's pregnancy, which has been difficult, and she wants to tell her what her own midwife recommends for the kind of nausea her sister described in her last letter. She has a jar of the preparation already made up to send with the letter, along with some of the better oil and a bracelet she found at the market that she thought her sister would like. She finishes the letter with a phrase that the translation cannot quite render without losing something. Something about missing her sister's voice, something about hoping the flood comes early and well this year, so that the distance between them is easier to travel. She folds the papyrus, ties it, applies her seal, and sets it with the objects to be sent. The afternoon light has shifted while she has been sitting here, moving from the harsh white of midday to the gentler gold of early evening, and the quality of the silence in the house has changed with it. Somewhere outside, someone is playing a flute, one of the neighbor's children, probably, practicing the phrase that has been coming from that direction for several evenings now. It is a simple melody, not particularly skilled, but it is pleasant. She listens for a moment. She thinks about her children, who will be home soon and hungry. She thinks about her husband and whether the day has gone well for him, and whether she will be able to tell from his face when he comes in before he has to say anything. She has known him for 11 years, and she usually can. She thinks about her sister's pregnancy and sends another quick, wordless prayer toward Taweret in the corner of the room. She stands up and puts the afternoon away and goes to see about the evening meal. Let us end in the dark, which is where we are now, and where the Egyptian night was also full. The Egyptian understanding of sleep and dreams was one in which the night was not simply the absence of the day, but a distinct state with its own geography, its own inhabitants, and its own possibilities. When an Egyptian woman lay down on her headrest, the curved wooden or stone support that held the head above the sleeping surface, and that also functioned as a protective magical object inscribed with the images of Bes, she was entering a different world, and she knew it. The gods of Egypt were active in the night. The sun god Re traveled through the 12 hours of the underworld between sunset and sunrise, encountering the enemies of order and defeating them with the help of the prayers and the magic of those who watched over him. The dead, who existed in a parallel world, accessible through the west, the land of the setting sun, could be closer at night than in the day. Protective rituals performed before sleep were therefore not merely psychological comfort. They were active contributions to the cosmological drama that played out every night, the ongoing struggle between order and chaos that the Egyptians believed required constant human participation and could not be left entirely to the gods. The headrest is one of the most significant domestic objects in Egyptian material culture precisely because it exists at the intersection of the practical and the magical. It holds the head, the seat of consciousness, the location of the face that is the person's identity. above the sleeping surface, which is both physically comfortable in a warm climate and symbolically important. The head is elevated, protected, held separate from the ground and from whatever might crawl or flow there. The protective images on the headrest extended this protection into the magical realm. The head of the sleeping woman, resting on its curved support, was surrounded by the benevolent power of Bes and his lion dwarf companions, shielded from the night demons that Egyptian demonology held responsible for illness, bad dreams, and the specific vulnerability of unguarded sleep. Dream interpretation in Egypt was a sophisticated tradition with both institutional and personal dimensions. The temple dream books, collections of interpreted dreams, organized by type and content, that served as reference works for professional interpreters, preserve something of the formal knowledge. But the personal dream interpretation that Egyptian women practiced in their private lives is glimpsed in the love poetry, where the beloved appears in dreams with the same charged physical reality as in waking life, in the petitions to the dead, where a deceased relative is asked to intercede by appearing in a dream, and in the magical texts, where specific rituals were performed before sleep to invite or to clarify a dream message. An Egyptian woman who woke from a particularly vivid or disturbing dream did not dismiss it as random neural activity. She considered it information, and she had a range of available interpretive frameworks and practical responses: prayers, amulet consultations, visits to a dream interpreter, specific ritual actions for processing that information. The night was also the time of the private magical practice that could not be performed in public view. The quiet burning of incense before a household shrine, the whispered spell over a sick child, the placement of a protective amulet beneath the sleeping mat. The household shrine, the small domestic altar that most Egyptian homes contained, whether a formal wooden cabinet or simply a corner of a room where images of protective deities were kept, was primarily a woman's space, tended daily by the woman of the house with offerings of water, food, flowers, and incense. This daily tending was a form of prayer, a maintenance of the relationship with the divine that kept the household safe and the gods attentive. It was intimate, private, and continuous. Not the dramatic public ritual of the temple, but the quiet daily conversation with the sacred that structured time and gave ordinary actions their deeper meaning. The Egyptian woman who lay down to sleep each night was someone who had navigated a world of extraordinary complexity, a legal system that gave her rights no other ancient woman possessed, a medical tradition that took her body seriously, a religious framework that gave her specific access to divine power, a cosmetic practice that was simultaneously aesthetic, medical, and spiritual, a domestic life that was both demanding and dignified, and an inner life documented in poetry, in magical texts, in dream practice, in the private rituals of the household shrine, that was rich, specific, and irreducible to any simple narrative. She was, in all the ways that matter, fully and specifically human, and the distance between her night and ours is smaller than it might seem. She lay down in the dark, on her headrest, under the stars of a sky she understood, in ways we are still learning to appreciate. She listened to the sound of the Nile in the distance. She breathed the smell of the oil lamp going out, and she slept, and that is where we leave her, sleeping on the banks of the Nile, 3,000 years away, dreaming in a language we cannot speak, and waking to a world we can only partially reconstruct. But tonight, for a little while, we were there. We were in the cosmetic chest, and the birthing bower, and the temple inner sanctum, and the weaving workshop, and the banquet, and the private magical practice of the household at night. We touched something real. I hope it carried you somewhere peaceful, and I hope it reminded you, as it always reminds me, that the people of the past were not simpler than us, not less than us, not reduced versions of what we have become. They were us in different circumstances, with different tools and different gods, and the same hunger to be beautiful and protected and loved and remembered. The Egyptian woman who anointed herself with lotus scented oil on a summer morning 3,000 years ago, who whispered a prayer over her sleeping child, who wrote a letter she hoped would reach her sister before the baby came, who lay down on her headrest and looked up at the stars through an opening in the roof and thought about everything she wanted and everything she feared. She is not a stranger. She is, in all the ways that matter, completely recognizable. We share more with her than we usually let ourselves acknowledge, and the recognition is one of the quiet gifts that history, when it is told well, can offer. If these slow histories are helping you sleep, the kindest thing you can do is subscribe. It takes 1 second, and it means you will never miss an episode. And when you wake up, drop a comment telling me where you listened from tonight and what time it was there. I read everyone. Until the next quiet evening, rest well, sleep deeply, and thank you for spending this time with Drowsy History.